At the beginning of the movie, it is shown that a landslide in several mountains in Norway creates a tsunami-like situation, resulting in many people losing their lives and an entire village being pushed to the brink of destruction. The area, being prone to landslides, faces the possibility of another tsunami. The story introduces Chris, a geologist by profession. Chris, along with his wife Adel, son Sondre and daughter Julia, lived in a village in Norway, surrounded by mountains and located near the sea. It was Chris's last day at work because they were about to relocate. However, his wife Adel couldn't join them at that moment because she worked at a hotel in the village. She would join them later. When Chris arrived at the office, he met several people, including his boss Arbit and his colleagues Margot, Jacob, and George. They were monitoring a large mountain after noticing a big crack during a survey. They had placed sensors on the mountain to track any changes and alert the town in advance. Afterward, they threw Chris a small farewell party. As the party ended and Chris packed up his things, he overheard his colleagues discussing the sudden loss of connection at stations 4 and 5. When Chris checked the monitors in the control room, he noticed that the signals at the two stations were fluctuating. Concerned, he raised the issue with his boss, Arbit, who reassured him that there was nothing to worry about and that they would handle it. When Chris got home, everyone began packing since they were leaving that day. Despite the few remaining tasks at home, Chris couldn't stop thinking about the signal disruption. He sat down with his laptop to investigate, feeling that something bad was about to happen. He decided to leave with his 2 children for another city, while Idul left for her hotel for a night shift. Meanwhile, as Chris was waiting for the ferry, he noticed a mountain by the side of the road that appeared to be in a dangerous condition. After staring at it for a moment, Chris decided to turn his car around and head back to his old town. He arrived at his office and asked his kids to wait in the car while he went inside to discuss the situation with his colleagues. After some discussion, Chris, along with one of his colleagues, took a helicopter to inspect the crack in the mountain. They carefully tied ropes around their waists and entered the crack to conduct tests. Inside, they found several wires that had been strangely torn apart. These wires were quite sturdy, so it was unlikely they would have torn on their own. Although Chris was worried, his colleagues didn't take him seriously. Chris continued to urge them to act immediately, warning that if nothing was done, a tsunami could form with waves as high as 40 to 50 feet, potentially sweeping the entire village away without leaving a trace. Chris suggested they activate the emergency alarm to warn the villagers so they could evacuate. Unfortunately, no one took Chris seriously. Feeling disheartened, Chris walked back to his car, where he found a note from his children. The note said they were tired of waiting and had gone with their mother, which made Chris head toward the hotel to meet them. Because of the delays, they couldn't leave the village that day. Chris, along with Julia, headed home while Sondre stayed at the hotel with his mother. Meanwhile, at the head office, an employee named George noticed signals indicating the water level was rising. He quickly informed senior staff, and upon seeing the situation on the monitor, Arbit and Jacob decided to head toward the mountain that night. They went to the crack to conduct tests. Later that night, Chris woke up and saw the mountain from his window. He felt uneasy and immediately called the head office. Meanwhile, while working at the site, some rocks fell on Arbit and Jacob, causing them to panic. But they continued their work. Chris looked up at the sky and saw a flock of birds flying away. He understood this was an ominous sign, as animals and birds can sense disasters before humans. Chris went back inside and started going through some old files. Meanwhile, the head office started receiving signals indicating a major disaster was about to strike, causing panic among everyone. Chris called the head office to inform them that he had found some old documents indicating a major disaster and urged them to get Arbit and Jacob out of the mountain crack immediately. When Arbit and Jacob tried to leave, a large rock fell on Jacob's leg, injuring him. They noticed that the distance between the two mountains was shrinking, and the thick iron pipes were breaking one by one. Chris then called the head office to instruct them to activate the emergency alarm in the village. As soon as the siren sounded, everyone woke up, and shortly after, a massive landslide occurred on the mountain, taking Arbit's life. Earthquakes were felt all over the city. Chris, along with Julia, managed to leave the house. Adel had already heard about the situation from Chris, so when she heard the siren, she realized the tsunami was coming. She rushed to warn everyone at the hotel. Meanwhile, Chris called Adul to tell her they only had 10 minutes to reach a higher place. Adul replied that she was on her way with Sandra to a safer location. By now, a huge wave had started forming due to the landslide, heading toward the village. People were running in panic on the roads, causing a traffic jam. Chris, looking at his watch, realized that 6 minutes had already passed, and they only had 4 minutes left. If they didn't reach a higher place at that time, everyone would die. He started running with Julia, telling people to get out of their cars. Meanwhile, as Adul was helping people get out of the hotel, she realized Sandra was missing. Unable to sleep, Sandra had gone to the basement to skate while listening to music on his headphones. Since he couldn't hear the siren or any noise, Adul frantically searched for him. At that moment, a woman named Maria and her husband came forward to help Adul, which caused them to miss the bus. On the other side, Chris looks at his watch and sees only 56 seconds are left. While running with Julia in his arms, he notices his neighbor's wife trapped between 2 cars. Chris sends his daughter to the neighbor and moves forward to help the woman. He somehow manages to move the cars and get the woman out. After that, both start running, but by now, the time is up and the giant wave crashes down. With no other option, Chris puts the woman in a car and gets inside himself. Within moments, the huge wave crashes over the cars, and everything is submerged in water. Meanwhile, Adul and Sandra, along with the elderly couple, come out of the hotel and see the massive wave about to hit their hotel in seconds. With no other option, they enter the hotel again, and the giant wave overflows into the hotel. Adul starts running with everyone toward the basement. Although they all manage to get in, Maria cannot make it and is swept away by the water. They manage to close the basement door, and immediately the power goes out. Meanwhile, Chris regains consciousness and finds that the neighbor's wife has died. He barely manages to get out of the overturned car and sees the surrounding devastation. His familiar city now feels unfamiliar to him. He pulls himself together and starts heading to a safe, high place to look for Julia. Eventually, he finds Julia safe. Chris's neighbor becomes devastated upon hearing the news of his wife's death. At this point, he borrows a phone from a man talking on his phone and starts searching for the bus that Adul and Sandra were supposed to arrive on. But not receiving any updates, he leaves Julia with the neighbor and sets out in search of the bus. Meanwhile, in the hotel basement, the water keeps rising. The situation is such that they can barely lift their heads above the water to take short breaths. They try to open the hotel door, but the strong current has knocked down a pillar, blocking their way. During this time, Philip, Maria's husband, starts trying to drown Adul and Sandra to save himself. Philip tries to push Sandra underwater, but Adul, in a fit of rage, pushes Philip under and, during a struggle, Philip dies. Adul is filled with remorse. Meanwhile, Chris enters the hotel, shouting for his wife and son. He even goes to the basement but leaves when he sees the water filling it. After searching, he finds Sandra's room and sees his son's belongings there. He believes his wife and son are likely no longer alive. Devastated, he picks up a metal pipe and starts hitting everything in anger and sorrow. The sound of the hits reaches the basement, and Adul and Sandra hear it, giving them hope to survive. They also start hitting the pipe with all their strength, and Chris understands someone is trapped in the basement. He runs to the basement and, taking a deep breath, jumps into the water-filled basement. He tries to open the basement door but finds large stones blocking the door. He starts removing the stones. Meanwhile, water starts entering through the ventilation pipe. Adul, with Sandra, tries to open the door, and after their combined efforts, they manage to open it. When the door opens, Chris and Adul are overjoyed to see each other. Chris helps Adul out first and then jumps back into the water to save his son. By this time, Sandra is very scared. Chris encourages him, telling him that his sister Julia is waiting for them outside. Sandra gathers his courage and swims toward Chris, but Chris is unable to move forward. Adul spots Sandra and asks about Chris, but Sandra cannot give a clear answer. Adul, determined, jumps back into the water and, after searching, finds Chris unconscious. He is pulled out of the water, and they see he is not breathing. Adul and Sandra begin performing CPR, and after a while, Chris's body starts to function normally. Together, they manage to escape from the wreckage and set off toward a new life. Julia, waiting for her family's return, is overjoyed to see them all come back and rushes to them in happiness. And so, the movie concludes with a powerful and emotional reunion as the family comes together, ready to embrace a new chapter of their lives after surviving the unimaginable.